Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. And welcome back to our final research focus presentation for this year's annual research symposium. We want to thank all of the presenters this week that have taken time out of their busy schedules to share some of the science happening behind the scenes to the latest in clinical trials for ALS research. Today, we're really excited to be joined by Dr. Sabrina Paganoni, investigator for the Centaur trial and the Healy trial. Today, she'll be providing an update for all of us on AMX0035, a compound treatment that showed promising results in phase 3 trial. She will be talking us through the compound's clinical development and the current pipeline for this compound treatment. And this is just on the heels of AMX Pharmaceuticals submitting a new drug application to the FDA. So very exciting, and we're really excited to get those updates. Before we go ahead and introduce Dr. Paganoni, I do just want to briefly thank our sponsors that helped to make this event possible. MT Pharma America, Providence Brain and Spine Institute, Pharma, and New Motion. And Pharma has just a short video that I'm going to play for all of you next.
The toughest of times brought out the best in us. And thanks to the collaboration between our scientists, the government, and others, each day millions of COVID-19 vaccine shots are protecting us. But we still face challenges, which is why America's biopharmaceutical scientists are working to combat variants, find new treatments, and make as many vaccines as the world needs. So while you do your part, we'll continue to do ours. Pharma, our work continues.
Thank you. Thank you to Pharma. Now, just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's webinar is scheduled for approximately 1 hour, which will include time for questions. All participants' video and microphones have been disabled to reduce interruptions, but we do encourage you to ask questions for Dr. Paganoni by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will hold questions until the end of Dr. Paganoni's presentation, and then we'll answer those live. So feel free to send them in and I will be collecting those. And today's presentation is being recorded for later viewing on our YouTube channel and will be available by email to all of you after today's presentation. And finally, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Sabrina Paganoni, who is a physician investigator for the Healy and AMG Center for ALS at Mass General. She's the co-director of the Neurological Research Institute at Mass General Hospital and assistant professor of physical medicine and rehab at Harvard Medical School. She's the co-principal investigator for the Healy ALS platform trial, which Dr. Nick Olney provided some information on Tuesday about. And she is also the principal investigator for the Centaur trial, which she will be talking about AMX0035 today. So thank you so much, Dr. Paganoni, and welcome.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to connect with all of you in Oregon. I joined last year. I really love the format of this, of what you do with the Oregon chapter, that you have research talks every day, I think for lunchtime for your time, which is fantastic. Great format, great week. And this is a week with a lot of announcements for ALS research. So I'm going to focus on the Centaur trial and the AMX0035 development program. Of course, feel free to ask me any questions about ALS research in general, but let me share my screen. And I think this should work. Perfect. So again, as promised last year when I came to talk to this group, we are really happy to provide regular updates about research. We do have several webinar series that we host every week, and so again, happy to connect now and connect over time. If you want to join our other webinars as well. There continues to be a lot of interest in ALS Research. Clearly this week we had several press releases in the ALS field. Really this means that there is a lot of excitement in terms of new trials, trial results, upcoming trials, lots of research, and overall this is great news because it means that the research is moving forward and that there are more opportunities to participate in trials for people living with ALS. So today I will provide updates on AMX0035 and answer your questions and talk about options for participation. So specifically, I'll talk about what's new, why it matters, and opportunities for you to get involved in the trial, in the new trial that just opened this week, in fact. So let me take a step back and just first briefly summarize the AMX clinical development program so far. So first of all, AMX0035 is a combination of two compounds known as PB and TERSO. PB and TERSO target different cell components to keep the nerve cells functioning properly. So specifically, TERSO reduces mitochondrial dysfunction, and the mitochondria are like the powerhouse of the cell. They're critical for maintaining energy production and cellular health. PB reduces endoplasmic reticulum, also known as ER stress. Now, the endoplasmic reticulum is a cell component that has several functions, and including the removal of toxic proteins and other debris that can damage the health of the cell. So while we know that many different mechanisms are involved in ALS, we know that the two mechanisms that I just mentioned, mitochondrial dysfunction and ER stress, are likely to be involved in most, if not all, forms of ALS as a common denominator. And so that's why we're excited to test the drug AMX0035 that combines it's not just one drug, but it really combines two drugs that target two important mechanisms such as mitochondrial dysfunction and ER stress. Now, individually, as individual compounds, they have already been of interest because in the lab, they had shown neuroprotective properties. But then when Amylyx Pharmaceuticals combined them, PB and TERSO together in the lab, the combination was found to have even greater effects on the health of motor neurons. And so that was seen in the lab, but that was exciting. And so that's why we decided to partner to test the drug in people living with ALS. And so we tested the combination of the two drugs for the first time in people living with ALS in what's known as the CENTAR trial. And I will explain the central trial in a second. Before I go there, just want to make sure that we sort of review the basics of clinical trials. In general, clinical trials go through different phases, phase 1, 2, 3, and then at that point, there's generally submission to the FDA. Now, phase 1 studies are typically small safety studies. We didn't need to do one for AMX0035 because the individual compounds had already been known. We knew that they were overall safe, and so there was no requirement to do a phase 1 study for AMX0035. So we proceeded directly to phase 2, and that's the CENTAR trial that I'm going to describe in a second. Phase 2 trials are typically of intermediate size, and they can test many things: safety, dosing, biomarkers, and efficacy. So we looked at all of this in the CENTAR trial. There is the possibility of FDA approval of a new drug simply based on robust data from a phase 2 trial, although typically the FDA also requires an additional trial, generally known as a phase 3 trial. So we're going to talk about how this overall framework impacts the AMX0035 development program. So the good news is that for AMX0035, let me just say that up front, the company was able to submit data to the FDA based on CENTAR data, based on the phase 2 trial. And at the same time, we're doing a phase 3 trial. I know that can be a little bit confusing, but I wanted to make sure that people understand that we have made a lot of progress along the usual framework. The phase 2 trial, known as CENTAR, was successful, and because of that, the data has been submitted to the FDA. At the same time, though, the phase 3 trial is ongoing in parallel as the FDA reviews the data from the phase 2. So let me tell you more about this. So again, the phase 2 trial known as Center has been completed and published, and I'm going to review the results soon, and the data has been submitted to the FDA. And the phase 3 study known as Phoenix actually just started this week. It was just announced today. The press release went out today. So very exciting news in terms of the progression of this drug development program. Let me tell you a little bit more about Center, the phase 2 study. First of all, I do want to emphasize, I always do when I speak about this trial, because that's very dear to me, that this was really a fantastic collaboration in the ALS community. We saw really the entire community come together, and I'm talking about patient groups, including the ALS Association and ALS Funding a Cure, that provided part of the initial funding to jumpstart the trial. The company, obviously, AMX Pharmaceuticals, I'm sorry, that has been working really closely with the ALS patient community and academic community. We worked in partnership with 25 sites that you can see listed on the map here. These were the 25 enrolling sites for the Center trial, and we coordinated the trial from the Healy Center for ALS at Mass General in Boston. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the participants in the trial. So the Center trial included 137 participants with ALS. The average age of the participants at the time of trial entry was 57 years. They were about 1 year after the first symptoms of ALS. About a quarter of them had bulbar onset, meaning that the first symptoms were difficulty swallowing or difficulty speaking. And importantly, the majority of participants was already receiving standard of care medication, which we define in the US as riluzole and or edaravone. So most people were already on standard of care medications, and so we really tested the effect of the drug on top of standard of care. The Center trial evaluated the following objectives. We tested the effect of the drug AMX0035 on physical function. That was tested over a 6-month period. Then we tested the effect of AMX0035 on survival long-term, up to 3 years. And obviously, we monitored the safety of the drug. Now, the results of the Center trial have already been published in 2 different papers. Here I'm providing the names of the 2 journals. In September 2020, we published the first paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. That's a screenshot of the first page. And we reported data on safety and physical function. There's both one manuscript as well as a supplementary appendix with a lot more data and information. Please note that I gave webinars on these papers in the past, and they are available for viewing on the NILS website. You can see the link on the slide. I also want to mention that both papers are available open access at the on the website of the publishers or of the journals. So if you go there and you want to read all the technical details, you can see all of them. Again, it's open access for everyone to see. The second paper was published in October 2020. We focused on survival, and that was published in the journal Muscle and Nerve. Let me tell you a little bit more about the study design of Center. So in Center, we enrolled 137 people with ALS who were randomly assigned to either active drug AMX0035 or placebo. The placebo-controlled period of the trial lasted 24 weeks, which is about 6 months. During this period, we measured efficacy by using a scale known as the ALS FRSR. That means ALS Functional Rating Scale Revised. It's the most commonly used functional rating scale for ALS. And in fact, it's possible that if you see ALS specialists at an ALS clinic, they might be asking you a series of 12 questions about daily function, for example, ability to speak, ability to swallow, respiration, ability to walk, ability to negotiate stairs. So those are the 12 questions that provide input into the ALS FRSR. So that's exactly how we measured function in the context of this trial. And we basically compared the 89 people were randomly assigned to active treatment to the 48 people that were randomly assigned to placebo, and we followed them for 6 months. Now, at the end of the 6-month placebo-controlled period, participants who completed the entire study, they were eligible to receive active drug long-term. And so the majority of people who completed the placebo-controlled period of the trial decided to go on active drug long-term. And we completed that long-term extension just a few weeks ago. And so that's why now we have the complete data, not only from the randomized period, but also from the OLE or open label extension. So let me quickly summarize the results. Now, during the randomized period, the 6-month period of the center trial, administration of AMX0035 resulted in functional benefit. So this means that the people who were assigned to AMX0035 had slower disease progression as measured on that scale, the ALS-FRSR scale. Specifically, the people who received AMX0035 scored 2.3 points higher on that scale compared to people who received placebo, which means that they retained better physical functions over the 6-month period. So to be clear, the drug did not stop and did not reverse the disease, but it made a difference in terms of rate of progression. We then followed these participants long-term because we wanted to see if better retention of function would also translate in better survival, and it did. Specifically, there was a 44% lower risk of death in the people that were originally started on AMX0035 compared to the people who were started on placebo. And this translates to about 6.5 months longer survival for the people who were originally randomized to AMX0035. So altogether, I think, positive results on both function and survival, I think they are significant. And so we were very excited about the results when we analyzed them. In the trial, the drug was overall safe and well tolerated. There was a minority of people who did experience some side effects, especially gastrointestinal side effects such as nausea, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. So we learned a lot from Center, and I'm really excited that this is a promising new therapeutic for ALS, and the data from this trial has been submitted to the FDA. So it is possible, depending on the review that the FDA does of the data, it's possible that there might be a new drug for ALS as early as 2022. Even more good news that I wanted to share, the data from Center has been donated by AMX Pharmaceuticals to shared resources, and I want to spend a minute to talk about that. Now, at the Healy Center, we coordinate a few central resources in collaboration with several fantastic partners listed on the slide, specifically the NILS ALS Consortium, the ALS Association, ALS Finding a Cure, the Neurological Institute, Project ALS, and Prize for Life. Now, the resources are called Proact. That's a clinical trial database that contains clinical data from people with ALS that completed previous trials. Now, pharmaceutical companies don't have to donate, it's their choice, but if they do donate, that directly contributes to new knowledge about ALS. I'm very pleased that AMX Pharmaceuticals decided to donate the data. And so why is that important? Because the Proact database is used by multiple researchers worldwide. It's freely shared, so it's free to use by anyone. And it's widely used to design new trials and to learn more about the progression of the disease, things like subgroups, different patterns. And again, it's freely shared with researchers. In addition, we collected biosamples, plasma samples from participants in Center. They were used as part of the analysis of the Center trial. And then the extra samples were donated to the NILS biorepository, which is housed both at MGH and at the Neurological Institute. And again, those samples are freely available to researchers worldwide for more research to develop new biomarker and develop new understanding of ALS. So we're particularly excited that the benefits of the Center trial are amplified because of this donation. Now, what's new? So what's new is that in the United States, AMX Pharmaceuticals announced earlier this week that they submitted a new drug application, also known as an NDA, to the FDA for AMX0035 for the treatment of ALS. That was published a couple of days ago. So this means that all the data that I just presented was put together as a submission to the FDA. This is several thousand pages. It contains data not just from the trial, but also contains data about toxicology, chemistry, manufacturing, labeling, all the sort of additional components of a drug, in addition to the clinical trial data, that are required to be submitted to the FDA so that the FDA can do a thorough review of all the aspects of the product. So what's the current information on timelines? So again, we know that the NDA was submitted as of this week, which is great news. What we don't know is if the FDA will accept the submission, meaning that they can also decline to review it, or they can accept it. So hopefully they will accept it, and then they will review it if accepted. But then we don't know if ultimately AMX0035 will be approved for the treatment of ALS. So this is just, the first step in the process. Clearly, it's an incredibly important step, but we don't know if the drug will be approved. If it is, it could be approved as early as next year. So that's fantastic. But it could take several months, or there could be a negative review as well. Obviously, we don't control the outcome. So what are we doing in the meantime while the review is in progress? Now, obviously, our goal is to get AMX0035 to all people living with ALS worldwide. So for this reason, we initiated the Phoenix phase 3 clinical trial. So the submission of the NDA does not impact this trial. The study is moving forward as planned to supplement the clinical development program of AMX0035 and to fulfill regulatory requirements worldwide. So in addition to the FDA, obviously, we hope that there's going to be positive reviews worldwide for other people living in Europe or other territories. So our clinical trial consortium, the NICE consortium, partnered with the TRICALS consortium, which is the European network of ALS clinics, and the study sponsored by ALS Pharmaceuticals. And this is really a great collaborative effort between the American Clinical Trial Consortium and the European Clinical Trial Consortium in collaboration with ALS Pharmaceuticals. And so in Europe, there is a requirement for a phase 3 study that's 1 year long. And so the Phoenix trial will fulfill those requirements. So let me compare the two. So Phoenix will be larger, about 600 participants as opposed to 137. It will be longer, again, to fulfill global regulatory needs, will be 48 weeks. It will be broader in terms of eligibility, meaning that more people can participate. We have a very specific population that was enrolled in center, and the population for Phoenix is broader. So we will learn more about the effect of the drug in a broader population, and you can see the criteria here. We will also collect a broader set of outcome measures, not only physical function and survival, which are obviously very important and we will measure, but we're also going to measure other important aspects of ALS, which I think we do want to learn more about, like hospitalization, feeding tube placement, BiPAP, quality of life, ALS stages, impact on caregivers. The more we learn about the drug, the better equipped we will be to have informed decisions in the clinic, if and when the drug is approved. So if people have questions about, will AMX0035 affect the quality of life, or will that have an impact on caregivers? Well, thanks to Phoenix, we will be able to answer those questions. So if and when the drug is approved, then we will have more answers for people who come to our clinic and ask us these very important questions. The design is the following for the Phoenix trial. We're talking about 600 people randomized 3-to-1 active to placebo at both US and European sites. The randomization ratio means that people who enter the trial will have a 60% chance of receiving AMX0035 and a 40% chance of receiving placebo during the placebo-controlled period of the trial, which is 48 weeks. However, at the end of that, participants will have the option to receive post-trial active drug, meaning that similar to what we did in center, they will have the opportunity to receive the active drug. Now, the phase 3 trial locations are in several countries, 12 countries, including the US, about 65 sites. US sites are being activated as we speak, and the list of sites will be posted online. So if you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and search by that specific study ID that you can see on the slide, you can you can see the sites as they are activated. So we hope that we're going to have about 30 sites in different locations in the US. Obviously, there was attention to geographic diversity, so hopefully there will be sites near you. And again, the process of selection is being completed as we speak, and the sites are being activated. So after a site has been selected, they need to be activated, meaning that they need to have certain trainings and certifications and other documents before they can be activated. So this is going to be a dynamic process. It's very typical for trials that not all sites are activated at the same time, because different institutions may need different times to be activated. And so please, you can follow that on clinicaltrials.gov so that you can see if there is a trial near you. Now, the good news is that as of today, we already know that the first few participants have been dosed in this trial. So now there's a few US sites that are, activated, as you can see on clinicaltrials.gov, and are now actively enrolling participants. So again, we're very excited that the trial has started, and obviously the trial will continue while the NDA review is in progress at the FDA, as I mentioned earlier. So I know this was a lot of information. I just want to summarize it quickly and then take your questions. The most important part of this webinar obviously is answering your questions. But just to recap, CENTER was a positive trial that answered many scientific questions and is supporting the new drug application to the FDA, again, that just went out earlier this week. Phoenix, a phase 3 trial, was designed to supplement the AMX0035 clinical development program and will be enrolling participants both in the US and Europe. And again, as of today, we know that the trial has officially started. So for more information on these programs, as well as other ALS trials, I would encourage you to talk to your physician. Again, I'm happy to answer your questions today, and I'm more than happy to continue to give webinars. We do have webinar series also at NEALS at the Healy Center. You can find the registration links on our websites, and we will continue to keep you posted. However, nothing can replace the personal connection that you have with your physician and with your ALS care center. So please talk to them about trial opportunities to see what the best option is for you. There are also some online resources. I'm listing them here. clinicaltrials.gov and neals.org do have information which is kept up to date on trials such as Phoenix and other trials. I really love the ALS signal from ALS that really shows a sort of in an interactive way available trials. Please contact our patient navigator at the Healy Center. There's many other resources. I'm just listing a few here: the ALS Association and the ALS Turner, ALS One, ALS Hope, and other foundations, as well as the CDC registry. They provide information about available trials. And I would like to end by thanking everyone who has been contributing to the AMX0035 development program. Dr. Sukovic, whose picture is next to mine on the slide, she's the senior author of this trial. I do want to thank ALS and the ALS Association that have done fantastic advocacy in support of this trial. I want to thank the NEALS Consortium and the enrolling sites, because really they were the boots on the ground in enrolling participants in CENTER, and they are now enrolling in Phoenix. And so I want to end by thanking all the participants in the CENTER trial and the current and future participants in the Phoenix trial. Clearly, we could not be developing drugs for ALS without the participation and partnership from so many brave patients with ALS and their families. So thank you so much for your support, and I will be happy to take your questions.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Paganoni. So much information, but all really exciting and moving in a continued forward direction, which is fantastic for people living with ALS and their families. So we've had some great questions come in, but first I'd like to start with, you of course talked about Amylyx announcing their plan to submit the new drug application. And of course, the challenge of knowing how that's going to move forward and is really in their hands. But out of curiosity, if they choose not to accept that new drug application, what typically happens? What's kind of the process?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of possible scenarios, right? They might require more information. For example, they might, need additional information, whether it's from the Phoenix trial or from other aspects of the program. As I said earlier, the NDA is not just about the clinical trial data, it's also about chemistry, manufacturing, toxicology, sort of more the chemical aspects of the product. So depending on what the review says and what type of data they need, they might request for more data, or they might just approve it. So obviously we're hoping that that's going to be the case. So all sorts of scenarios are possible, and we just won't know until we get there, which is why it's so important that the Phoenix trial has now already started, because we do want to supplement the program and be ready for any scenario, really.
Yeah, great, thank you. There was a question that came in about the difference in outcome for the phase 2 trial for those who were taking Radicava and Riluzole and others that were not taking those drugs. Did you see any difference in data?
Yeah, great question. Well, most people were taking at least one of the two, and the trial was not powered to look at subgroups, meaning, those who were on Radicava but not Riluzole, or vice versa, or both, or neither. So what we did do was a series of sensitivity analysis to see if the results of the trial were affected by taking background medications. And the answer was no, that basically, the trial results stand and are not, affected by those medications, meaning that the results are on top of standard of care. Now, in the Phoenix trial, the population will be stratified according to background medications, which will help us answer more questions about about a possible interaction between these drugs. Again, in the central trial, we didn't see any, and the results stand on top of standard of care.
Okay, kind of along those same lines, a kind of two-part question. At least locally, we've known of some people who are taking the off-label version of the supplement TUDCA or Torso, and getting prescribed the sodium phenylbutyrate. Curious what your perspective is on people taking those medications, kind of the off-label. And then also kind of a secondary part of that question, if those people are doing that, can they still qualify for the Phoenix trial?
So, first of all, in the center trial, which is the trial that we completed, we studied AMX0035, which is a pharmaceutical grade combination with specific formulation of these two compounds, PB and Torso. So the data I showed are about that specific product, whether an off-label use of these compounds, sort of, as individual compounds that then are taken off-label, works or not. I don't have data to show that. I completely understand that people might want to do that while we are awaiting kind of the FDA review and the results of the Phoenix trial. If somebody decides to go their route, they would not be eligible for the trial, because obviously, that basically, you cannot take sort of twice the amount, but again, I think it's important that we do this trial so that we can, answer, more questions about the drug, and then hopefully there will be soon a positive FDA review, so that we don't have the question about whether the off-label cocktail, so to speak, works or not, and we can just have access to the pharmaceutical grade product.
Thank you. That's a really helpful answer to that, because of course it's understandable that people are trying to access, promising looking treatment ahead of time, but of course have to consider those eligibility requirements for, future trials. And speaking of eligibility requirements, there's a question about eligibility for the phase 3 trial, the Phoenix trial. any stage of ALS being eligible, or where people need to be in the progression of the disease?
Yeah, so just to review the sort of the key ones, it's not an exhaustive list, but the key criteria are having a diagnosis of ALS defined as definite or probable. That's based on the physical examination that your neurologist can do for you. And symptoms have to be present for less than 2 years, and respiratory function needs to be at least 55% or predicted, 55% or predicted. So these are some of the key criteria. If you go to the clinicaltrials.gov page that I had on my slide earlier, and you put in the study code, you can see the full list of criteria so that you can better tailor that to your specific situation. I would say that some of these criteria, there's also other criteria that require really interaction with your physician to be able to tell if you meet those criteria or not. So again, that's why I really emphasize talking to your ALS care team and physician so that they can tell you whether you're likely to qualify or not.
Great, thank you. Jumping kind of back to some of the results that you shared from the phase 2 trial, I think you talked about this, but could you expand a little bit on whether you were seeing most of these improvements in PALs that were kind of seen in more early onset of the disease or further along in the disease progression, and whether you saw any difference in that?
Yeah, so the data that we have are from the center trial, and in the center trial, in order to qualify, people had to be within 18 months from symptom onset. So I would say on the early phase. That doesn't mean that people that were later on in the disease course wouldn't benefit. We just didn't test for it. So again, I can only tell you what we tested for. In the Phoenix trial, we will take people that have had symptoms for 2 years, up to 2 years. So we will be able to tell more, tell you more about up to 2 years. Now, I do want to say that it is reasonable to assume that people even at later stages might benefit, even if we didn't formally test for it, because the mechanisms of disease are similar. So obviously, ideally one would start the treatment as soon as possible. However, we don't have any data to suggest that people no longer benefit. Again, we didn't test for it specifically, so we don't have data to suggest that they do or they don't. We just haven't tested it. But it's reasonable to think that people that, with all types of ALS might benefit because the mechanisms that the drug targets are thought to be common to all types of ALS.
Thank you. There's kind of a question along these same lines, but more generally about clinical trials, just in terms of eligibility requirements. Someone asks, why is there a cutoff essentially in terms of length of disease progression or time? A person having had ALS for, over 5 years, for example. Could you just kind of generally speak to
No, that's a great question. So every late stage clinical trial for ALS does have some specific requirements. Now, in the early phases, maybe some phase 1 trials or some more open label trials, they might be more relaxed in terms of inclusion exclusion criteria. But the trials that are sort of in phase 2 to 3, they do have strict criteria for very specific reasons. Now, the goal of these trials is to be able to tell if a drug works or not. And the goal of the trial is to do so as quickly as possible, and by enrolling, participants again as quickly as possible so that we can tell if the drug works or not for everyone else. Now, if we were to enroll people that have very different types of the disease, it would take an extraordinarily large and long trial to be able to tell if the drug works or not, because the participants are too different from one another, which means that we need to study more people and we need to follow them longer. So by expanding the trial criteria, we actually make trials by definition longer and larger, meaning that it's going to take more time to get to an answer. So I really see clinical trials as scientific experiments to be able to test if a drug is effective or not, with the understanding that if the drug works, then it should be applicable to everyone. So it is, disappointing not to be able to enter a trial, but I do want to point out that there's very specific statistical reasons, and we really want to try to balance access with efficiency of the trial. And then again, the good news is that if we can do these trials quickly, like the platform trial, for example, or the Phoenix trial, then if the drug is positive, then it will be applicable to everyone.
Oh, great, thank you. You've kind of answered this in a way, but I do want to ask it because it's kind of an interesting question. Do you look at the rate of progression for participants, and are in the Centaur trial, for example, and are you planning on doing this in the Phoenix trial?
Yeah, so not before they enter the trial, but while they are on the trial. Absolutely, that's actually the primary outcome. So in other words, you after somebody enters the trial, you track if their progression is rapid, average, or slow, with respect to the placebo group. And that's how you can tell if the drug works or not.
Great. Let me see here. Given the positive results in the phase 2 trial, why is a placebo arm required in phase 3? Could success not be tied to overall average progression versus comparing against a placebo group?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, in general, I mean, we submitted the data to the FDA, and we would hope that that's enough to gain approval. So in a way, the hope is that, in a way that, the phase 3 trial is an addition, but hopefully even just with the phase 2 trial, the drug can be approved. In terms of the phase 3 trial, that's important. It's still important to have a placebo group, because that's really the only way to tell in the context of the trial if something works or not. I would want to, if you don't mind, I put in a plug today at 5 p.m. Eastern, which is 2 p.m. for you Pacific. We have, as part of our weekly platform trial webinars, we actually have a webinar about biostatistics, and that's going to address exactly that question. So I'm not a biostatistician. I can explain that to you in simple terms, but if you want to have a statistician explain how this works exactly, I would invite you to join us today, and the webinar will be recorded and put on the Healy Center website. Again, unfortunately, in ALS, we still need the use of placebos to tell if a drug is effective or not. Hopefully we can do trial designs like the platform trial, where we minimize the need for placebo, and when we offer open label extension, so that at the end of the placebo control period there is access to active drug. However, in order to be able to do what the trial is supposed to do, which is to tell if the drug is effective or not, the placebo group is still unfortunately needed.
Just right along those lines, if FDA approves the current NDA before phase 3 trial ends, will the phase 3 trial early so everybody can have access?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I cannot say anything official because the plans are still being finalized, but what I can tell you is that certainly there is the commitment to transition participants as soon as the drug is available commercially. The problem is that we don't know when that's going to happen. So I think it's really important to start the trial as soon as possible, enroll as soon as possible. And then again, if and when the drug becomes commercially available, there is the commitment to make things right for the participants. So I'm pretty sure that that's going to be addressed when we get there. I do want to point out that the European Medicines Agency needs 1-year data that's publicly stated on their website in general for drug development for ALS. They do want 1-year trials. And so the European sites, again, are in that context. And so the trial will enroll both in the US and in Europe. So there might be differences in terms of how that's handled because of the specific regulations and laws in Europe as opposed to the US.
That's helpful.
But I know that there is commitment to keep the community posted on this.
Kind of veering back a little bit, you talked about AMX donating the data to the Proact database. I'm just curious, how common does that actually happen, and what happens to the data?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So at this point, I think there's over 10,000 participant level data in the Proact database, meaning that there's been a number of companies, I believe from about 25 clinical trials, that have donated data to Proact, and it's over 10,000 people, data from over 10,000 people that have been donated. So I don't know the percentage of companies that decides to donate, but certainly, we're very excited that many companies did decide to donate. Ideally, we would see that from everyone so that, we can continue to expand the database. Now, the database is used widely for clinical trial design. For example, the same center trial was designed based on data from Proact and simulations based on that. The platform trial was designed based on simulations on Proact. So we talked earlier about the need for placebo or certain inclusion-exclusion criteria. Believe me, we try to minimize placebo and make the inclusion-exclusion criteria as broad as possible, but we do use things like Proact to simulate and predict how each choice would impact the statistical power of the trial. In other words, statistical power is the power to see a treatment effect if the drug is effective. We want that to be high because we want to maximize the chances of success of a clinical trial. Changing ratio between active or placebo or inclusion-exclusion criteria does affect that. We use the Proact database that contains data from different people from different trials to model the effect of every choice. And then we basically make the final decisions trying to achieve the best possible balance between access and statistical power. So we need both, and we need to achieve a balance. And Proact is used to model that. So the more data we have, the more precise our simulations and predictions can be.
Well, it's wonderful news to know that AMX donated that, because it sounds like it's increasingly important for future trials just in general. There was a question about the functional ALS scale, and you talked about how it's used in a clinical setting. Can you speak to how it's kind of been used in clinical trials over time?
Yeah, I would say that that's the most commonly used scale. It's used by most clinics, I would say, to track progression clinically for clinical purposes. And then it's used by most clinical trials to tell if a drug is effective or not, with the idea is being that if a drug is effective, people will retain physical functions longer. The scale itself measures function along 12 domains, things like swallowing, ability to speak, ability to walk. And so the idea is that if a drug has a global effect, then you'll see effect on the scale.
Question about might there be FDA feedback in the new drug application that could impact the phase 3 trial design? I.e., is it premature to start without their feedback?
So every trial is launched after the, that's true for every trial. The FDA always reviews the protocol ahead of time and the trial design, and so gives approval to proceed or not. That's called an IND, or investigational new drug. Basically, you cannot start without submitting the protocol to the FDA. And so, again, I think that the trial has been well designed, and the trial is already launched. So I think it's been well designed with input from multiple stakeholders, and I think that the NDA application is a separate process. Again, we just hope that the NDA application review will be positive.
Yeah. This is not related to the Centaur trial at all, but as I understand, you work closely with PLS and co-chair the PLS task force. Is that right? And we have a number of people living with PLS as part of our chapter, and frequently asking what research opportunities there are for people with PLS or even PMA. And just with your background and your history, I'm wondering if you have any information to share about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So first of all, we think that PLS and PMA are two different variants that have a very specific course. And for that reason, because they're different from classic ALS, they're typically not enrolled in ALS trials because, again, the the course and the outcomes are different. Now, there is a lot of research going on right now in PLS. I think that we are at the time where we first need to better define the natural history of PLS and the best ways to track progression, because we cannot just use the same tools that we use in ALS. That's been the main barrier to drug development in PLS. I'm glad that there are some current efforts and many sites are participating in the PLS natural history study led by Dr. Mitsumoto from Columbia, and other studies that are trying to clarify, to better clarify PLS. The more we know about PLS, the sooner we can start clinical trials.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to hear that there's some movement in that area. It's really, really exciting. So I want to be sensitive to time. I'd like to just ask a couple of more questions. One of those questions is just, and you've already sort of talked about this, but in terms of access to clinical trials, what would you suggest for folks who are living with ALS who are outside of clinical trial participation range? Do you have just clinically or just from your background suggestions or ideas for those individuals who don't quite fit into the clinical trial?
Yeah, I think it's important to discuss that with your physician. There is a growing interest in compassionate use, also known as expanded access. There are different groups that are starting these programs specifically for people who are not eligible for clinical trials. Now, this is sort of a new emerging field. So unfortunately, as of right now, there's only limited programs like that, but I think, I hope that they will become more common over the next few months. There might be also an expanded access program of AMX0035, and we will have a webinar by the end of the year with Amylyx Pharmaceuticals. We're working closely with the patient community and Amylyx to launch this expanded access program, so that for people that are not eligible for Phoenix, the trial, there's going to be this other option, hopefully early in 2022, while waiting for the drug to be approved. So there's certainly many efforts, and I think these efforts really are really supported by the great interest from the community and patient advocacy. So I just want to say that certainly the patient advocacy has really helped in this respect, and I think many of us are very receptive to that and are working hard to launch some expanded access programs. We do have a few available at the Healy Center. We're working in collaboration with many sites of the NILS Consortium to facilitate the adoption of that at other sites nationwide.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And finally, as we've been talking about with every presenter this entire week, we get so excited when a clinical trial shows really positive results like the Centaur trial did. But of course, many more show disappointing results and, the challenges that come up with just science and clinical trials and that we experience. With all of that said, what kind of keeps you going in pursuing ALS research with, so many frustrations and results that can be really, really challenging? What kind of gives you hope and keeps you moving in the research space?
Right, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think that if you look at the pace of research and the number of clinical programs that are available now, the number is extraordinary. It's really extraordinarily high compared to just 5 years ago. So I think what really gives me hope is the critical mass of programs that are now kind of really moving forward all at the same time. I think that that's really important to know. Some of the earlier programs, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they really didn't have nearly as much science to back them up. So I think that now we are seeing an explosion of science, lots of new knowledge, many new targets that's now translating into a large number of clinical trials. So I would really encourage people to connect with the resources I put on the slide earlier to really explore different options for trials, whether it's Phoenix, the platform trial, many other trials sponsored by investigators or industry. They are enrolling at different sites in the US, and I think we continue to open more. So I think that the more if obviously in the past we were only testing, one drug a year or so, now we're testing multiple. So just because of the critical mass, I do think that there's going to be a lot more successes because there's more interest and just more research on it and more investment. So I also do want to say that, raising awareness, philanthropy, donations, support to research, they all contribute.
Thank you. Well, that's hopeful to hear. And I really, really want to thank you, Dr. Paganoni, for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us and share your insights and your experience and help answer questions. Yeah. It is a pleasure to be able to host you.
Yeah. And last year we said one day I would come in person. I've never been to Oregon, so hopefully not this year, maybe next year or soon.
Fingers, yes, we would love that. Well, yeah, thank you again. And thank you to everyone who took time to carve out of their schedule to join us this week. Today is our last presentation for our annual research week. Every single one of these presentations has been recorded, and you will receive an email with the link that you can access all of those recordings. You will also receive a link for a survey just to tell us about your experience with the week, interest in research presentations that you would like to see next year. So please take a moment to submit that. Should just take you a minute out of your time. But again, thank you, Dr. Paganoni, and thank you to all of you watching today, and hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.